Hello and welcome to another Sonic Lab presentation. Actually today we've got something special. We've got Tom in, and what we're looking at is, I guess it's the first public look at the Live 12 public beta, which will be available at a download near you quite soon, right?
That is correct, yeah.
So what's different? I mean, that's an easy question to ask, but a difficult one to answer, I'd imagine, in one go anyway. So what are the primary differences here?
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of really cool new stuff in this new version. But a good place to start is because it's the first thing that everybody sees, is you're going to notice a little bit of a kind of updated, refined user interface. I won't get into too much detail about everything that's going on there, but just looking at it, you can see it kind of looks a lot cleaner, looks a lot nicer. But there's some really sort of important additions as well, things like larger faders on the mixer over here. If I just play something, you'll see that you get a lot more kind of visibility into your levels on your tracks, even these mixers in between the devices, you get a lot more visibility as well. And there's just lots of kind of little small changes to the interface throughout. In terms of navigating around the interface, there's a couple changes as well. So obviously these nice big faders are great here in the session view in Ableton Live, which you would sort of typically use for mixing. But a new feature, if we switch over to the arrangement view, which is our timeline view in Ableton, is you can now see the mixer directly in the arrangement view.
Nice.
With everything that you would get that you're used to in the mixer in the session view, right there.
And can you scale that? Can you make the mixer take less room in that view?
Exactly. You can scale that up and down. You can have it take up kind of most of the screen if you want in that view, and you just sort of hide and show it using this toggle down in the bottom here, which
that's going to be an important
is
factor.
pretty handy. Also, while we're down in this kind of bottom area here, if I hop back over to the session view, this area of Live is where you have your devices and your clips, and in previous versions of Live, you sort of toggle between the two. So if I have a clip selected over here, you would see your notes, and then you see your devices. We now have what's called stacked detail view, where I can have both of those visible at the same time. And if I expand that out, I can see the MIDI editor and the devices all at the same time, which just kind of makes the interface a lot more flexible. It's great for if you're editing drums and you want to manipulate the sound of that, or maybe you are recording some automation into a track and you want to see the controls as you're recording.
Yeah.
And you'll notice as well, while I'm sort of mentioning this, is they've pulled the notes, envelope, and MPE views in the MIDI editor. They used to be in this sidebar here. They're now up at the top, which kind of makes a lot more sense. Somewhat related to that, though, is kind of an exciting new feature, I think, in Live 12, is that Live is now completely accessible. So for people who have some kind of accessibility needs, like partial sightedness or blindness, there's some new options in Live 12 to help for that. So, for example, up in the options menu here, you'll see there's this accessibility setting where you can speak various parts of the interface for people with a screen reader. But sort of even more importantly is this new navigate menu that lets you get around the interface using nothing but a keyboard. So for somebody who can't actually see the screen and needs to use a keyboard to navigate, you can use various keyboard shortcuts to jump to different parts of the interface and tab through different sections and kind of control everything from there. So moving on from some of the kind of interface stuff, if I just hide these sections, we're going to get into some interesting sound stuff shortly, but we're dealing with kind of all the workflow stuff first. There have been some really cool additions to the browser. So the browser is obviously there to help you find the sounds and effects that you want as quickly as possible. And so the new additions are kind of designed to streamline that workflow. So how the browser used to work is if you went into, say, something like the sounds category, usually what you would see is these sounds would be grouped into different folders, pads, keys, etc. Now what you get is you just get a list of everything in that category. And there is a new filtering system, which you can toggle open here, that lets you filter sounds based on various different tags. So for example, if I wanted to find an MPE preset that is a bass and is analog, it's now filtered down the sounds that are available to me based on those tags.
So presumably those are kind of pre-built into Live as it stands, but you can modify those and change them up and
Exactly. So if I hit this edit button over here, there are a whole bunch of tags that come built into Live. You can see you've got things like the type of sound you might be working with, different kind of drum hits, etc. But you can also create your own. So all these tags are divided into what are called groups. So groupings are just kind of categories of tags. You can create your own new groups, new tags.
So it's like metadata for all of the stuff.
Exactly. So it's pretty flexible. And the way it works to tag is if I select a sound in the browser and maybe this is, I'll go into sound character. This is kind of analog. So I tick that button. It's now tagged with analog.
Right.
All of the built-in sounds, all the Ableton packs and sounds come pre-tagged. So you can immediately just sort of search for those. But all of your own sounds, plugins, samples, you'll need to go in and kind of manually tag yourself. And so that you'll see is kind of the way that you interact with all the different sections of the browser. If I go into the plugins section, again, you can filter by different categories. And it sort of reveals the tags that are relevant to that category. So it just makes finding things pretty easy and sort of intuitive.
Right, cool.
Along with that, there's been some slight improvements to the search bar as well. So the search bar is still pretty good for finding very specific things. But you now also have browser history. So very much like you have the sort of history, your back and forward buttons in a web browser, I can click backwards or forwards to cycle through previous, essentially, views that I've had in the browser, whether it's a search I've done, a filter I've done. You can cycle through those. There's also something called sound similarity search. If I select a sound, you'll notice there's this little kind of squiggly line icon. And if I click on that, what that does is it shows me now in the browser a whole bunch of sounds that are related to that first sound that I selected. And so if I click on these, you should hear they're all going to be somewhat similar to the sound that I started
plucky
with.
detuned, yeah, string.
Exactly.
Dulcimer.
And so again, if you go in and you tag all your own sounds and samples, it'll work for that as well. You can also save filters if you find maybe you quite like this particular filter you've got. Hit that button and add it into the sidebar, and you can save that with whatever you want. Call it pluck, and you can add all those different kinds of browser filters. So it just sort of makes the browser a lot more flexible and kind of quick to work with and find the sounds you're looking for. Cool, so sort of a category of new additions is around keys and scales and tuning. So previously we had keys and scales were available in clips in Live. So you could go into a clip, for example, and you could set the scale of the individual clip. We now have that up at the top of the session here.
Right, okay.
So for example, this particular clip over here I happen to know is in a C major scale. And you'll see that that just reflects the key of the currently selected clip.
Presumably must mean there's an ability to conform across a variety of devices and MIDI and whatnot, right?
Exactly. So it's sort of more exciting than just having that based into your clips, which is kind of some useful stuff for programming MIDI, is there is a new feature called scale awareness. And you'll see that in a lot of the MIDI effects, which have been updated for Live 12. And what scale awareness does is it lets certain devices be aware of the global key and do certain things based on that. So for example, a really simple thing to look at might be this random MIDI device, which randomizes the pitch of your MIDI data. Normally, if I were to play a note here, if I turn this up, it's just going to give me completely random notes.
Right.
If I enable scale awareness, which is this little icon over here, now it's only going to give me notes within the global key that I've set. In this case, B minor. And so you'll see that's present in a lot of the built-in MIDI effects. So for example, the chords, you can have scale awareness. So it's only going to have notes that are going to be in the scale that you're using.
Okay.
Arpeggiator's got scale awareness, pitch, scale, the scale MIDI device as well as you'll notice some sort of redesigned look and feel to some of these devices, most notably in the arpeggiator and the scale. And they're just kind of much nicer to work with.
So that only applies to the sort of MIDI data. We're not getting to the point where it'll retune my recorded bass line in audio, right?
No, so nothing with the audio yet. All this kind of keys and scale stuff is
you can see that coming down the line, though, quite easily, I suppose. I mean, it would make sense, but...
Yeah. There's some, so the MIDI devices is kind of a really obvious use case for that, but there's some really interesting stuff which we'll get to when we look at the new instruments, where this scale awareness starts to come into instruments that are built into Ableton as well, which is pretty fun. But we'll get to that in a little bit. If I open up the browser, you'll see we have this category in the browser called tunings. And so Live now supports tuning and temperament within the session. So this is something that a lot of people might not be aware of. It's quite kind of a novel concept. And this doesn't refer to sort of scales in the sense of major and minor. It's the actual tuning of the notes within the scale.
Right, so I suppose we're all used to Western tuning, so we go, what do you want that for? But actually, Indian or Tibetan or whatever, there's a load of different modes, right, okay.
Exactly, yeah. So we're all used to what's called 12-tone equal temperament tuning, but there's actually thousands of different kinds of tuning systems for different cultures and different approaches that are available, and you can now use those in Live. So if I play a C major scale. Sounds like what we're used to for a C major scale. But if I go in here and I choose from these various tuning files and I just load one of these up, just by double clicking, and you see it loads into this area. If I play that same, you hear those last two notes, it's still playing kind of that same shape, but the tuning of them is slightly different. And so there's all these kinds of different tuning files that you can work with, and they work with the scalar standard. Cool, so next let's take a look at what I think is probably one of my favorite new features, which is called MIDI Tools. So if I create a new MIDI clip here and go into the MIDI editor, we've got a handful of built-in tools that let you create and transform MIDI data in a number of interesting ways. You might have noticed there's some extra buttons just in this sort of basic pitch and time here. We've got things like fit to scale, humanize, etc. But where this is kind of really interesting is with these generate and transform tabs. And what these give us are various different tools for creating and transforming MIDI data. So you'll see there's a number of different tools. The one that I have here is called Seed. And what Seed does is using these kind of controls, and you can see as soon as I start adjusting them, it is going to create MIDI information for me. Seed in particular is really good at creating kind of melodic phrases. So if I play this clip, in this case we're in the key of C major because this clip happens to be in C major, and it's just generating notes for me in C major. I can hit this button, generates a new melodic pattern, and I have control over things like the density of the pattern.
All right, so that's a real-time control as well, right?
Exactly, so this is all happening in real time, and if I turn off this generate button, that's going to kind of lock the generation in place there. If I wanted to delete this, maybe start again, I just hit generate, and as long as that generate button is on, any adjustments I make are going to be adjusted here in real time. So Seed is just one example of the things we could add in here. If I delete these notes, I'll go over to kind of one of my favorite ones, which is Stacks, which is a chord generator. And so you can have up to 4 separate chords. So I generate. Let's increase the root notes of that. And you'll see I can switch this between various different scale or chord types, chord shapes. And I can add multiple chords in here. So it's created a second chord. You can do things like invert the chords. And so all of these generators, we'll look at some of the transforms now, are all kind of unique in what they do. What's quite exciting as well, though, is that this area is also open for Max for Live. So third-party developers could create their own completely unique tools that just generate MIDI data right inside of the piano roll.
Well, I could see immediately, certainly with the generate thing and having real-time control of that, that's almost like, and you were sending that out to CV tools, you've immediately, I mean, essentially, there are lots of modules that do that stochastic sequencing and, generative stuff, and this is sort of performing that function as well to a degree, right?
Exactly, but I think the sort of huge benefit of this is that it just all happens right in the piano roll, and it's an interface that you're kind of used to. When I've generated some sort of basic chords, I can go in here and edit these as I would any other MIDI notes. For example, if we move on to looking at some of the transform tools, if I select these chords, so generate helps you create new patterns, transform helps you manipulate existing ones. So for example, one of the transform tools is called arpeggiate. And you'll see as soon as I start adjusting this, that real-time arpeggiates those chords that I had there. And I can adjust some of the parameters of the arpeggiation. Or if I don't like it, I just turn that off, and that's now not being applied. So it's all just happening in real time. So arpeggiate, for example, is one of the ones we might work with here. I'll go back to the chords. We've got something like strum, which lets you, if I just turn that on, so it's happening in real time, lets you strum chords.
Right,
so
nice.
Again, the sort of real idea with these MIDI tools is that they're just doing interesting things to the MIDI data, but what they're doing is all up to the tool itself. This even extends to things like if I head over to, say, a drum part. I've got this drum part over here that's got a little bit of kind of a wonky timing to it. I can select those notes and I can go to the quantize transform tool, which lets me apply real-time quantization to it. So as I increase this amount control, you can see those notes are shifting onto the grid. But as opposed to sort of just quantizing it and being fixed, what I can do is, as this is playing, I can just sort of dial in and listen and find exactly the amount of quantization that I want there.
That's a nice feature, because it's always been sort of think about it, apply, rather than, yeah. So.
Exactly. So you can.
And are these automatable parameters? Can you actually control those from something?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, these are just kind of controlled with the mouse. And the way that they work is you either the generator or the transform, you sort of work with it and apply it. When you deselect the notes, that's now applied.
Right,
so
okay.
if I go back in and select those notes, it's going to now apply sort of additional quantization on top of that.
Right, okay,
and
got
adjusting what was there before. In addition to these, there are also some new kind of editing tools built right into the editor. So for example, if I'm just going to create a really long hi-hat pattern here. Let's go back to the Notes tab, hi-hat note. If I press Command E, it's going to split that note up based on the current grid, which is quite useful. If I hold down Shift E, you'll see I get like a little blade tool, and I can click anywhere to slice up that note. And then the last one is if I hold Alt E, you'll see I get that kind of up arrow, and I can divide a note up into a certain number of divisions. So if I divide that up into 16th notes, and this can be really fun for doing maybe over here, I want to have like a septuplet. I'm going to hold Alt E, and I can divide that into 7/4. You want to create some kind of really wonky hip-hop feel.
Interesting.
And these all pair pretty nicely as well with the transform tools. For example, maybe I go to the time warp transform tool that lets me sort of stretch the timing of that pattern as well, have it kind of slow down or speed up. So all these new additions to the MIDI tools kind of work in tandem quite well to let you program really interesting MIDI stuff. Also with this is some updated chance controls. So chance was something that was added in previous versions of Live. And chance just essentially lets you define the probability that notes are going to trigger.
Yeah.
The addition here is that we now have probability groups. If I select a bunch of notes, I can group them together so that their probability is linked. So instead of each one of those hi-hats sort of having their own probability,
yeah. That's handy.
Either it's going to play the whole group or it's not going to play the whole group. So that's kind of really interesting for maybe you have an entire chord.
Do they have to be contiguous? Could you have like this one and then, not the one in the middle, and so...
No, you can group them kind of across different notes like that.
I mean, because probability is really handy for programming beats. If you've just got a one-bar pattern, you could go crazy with the probability and suddenly it becomes infinitely variable. It's
exactly, and
really useful.
Sort of one thing that's quite fun to do with these groups is having drum fills, where you can have the entire drum fill that only plays every so often. Instead of just individual notes, you can kind of group together a whole drum fill, which is pretty cool.
Neat.
Should we take a look at some of the new instruments and effects?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people always get excited by devices, so...
The first thing we'll look at is something kind of familiar but new, and that is an updated granulator device. So people might be familiar with Granulator 2, which is a Max for Live device that's been around for a while, designed by Robert Henke, who's one of the co-founders of Ableton. And it's a granular synth, and it's just got a really nice UI update for Live 12. So this is what it looks like. You can load samples into it, just to give you an idea of what a granular synthesizer sort of sounds like. We've got layers of samples over the top of one another. And it functions pretty much the same as Granulator 2 does. There's a couple additional features. For example, we've got MPE support. There's these additional modes like cloud mode, classic mode. But anyone who's used to Granulator 2 will just really enjoy this new kind of visual update. They've also improved the way that you can live sample into the device as well. Right. So you can select an input and live capture directly into the synth and immediately just sort of play it, which is pretty fun. There's a new native live device called Meld. And so there's quite a lot going on with this synth. At the most basic level, the kind of concept of Meld is that we have these two oscillators, and each oscillator has some really interesting oscillator shapes. So we've got some pretty simple stuff like basic shapes, and each oscillator has two macro controls. In this case, moving between the shapes.
So is it like a wavetable, effectively, or is it more...
So this particular oscillator is quite similar to a wavetable, but what's really interesting about Meld is each oscillator is completely unique and sort of distinct.
Wow,
so for example,
sub-engine almost, yeah.
If I swap over to swarm sine, this is a sine wave swarm oscillator, and you'll see the macro controls have changed. And so this does something kind of totally unique and different. These swarm oscillators are great, really love those.
That's nice.
It's things like the chip oscillator. So they each kind of have their own way of working. There's even some weird things like a shepherd tone oscillator. that just generates a constantly
Yeah.
rising or falling tone.
Very handy for stuff.
Exactly. It's a bit of a sort of sound designer's dream, this synth, because there's just so much to play with in here. So you've got these really interesting oscillators. There's 2 of them. You've got the usual sort of bank of envelopes, LFOs, and things that you can manipulate with a wavetable style modulation matrix, and you can pop that out into a nice big full screen view. Like you could with
That's
wavetable.
really handy. So, I mean, notice there's a couple of other features in there where you can pop just more information you can use in the top panel. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly, yeah. It makes it really sort of easy to work with. Quite a unique feature here is you've got this LFO, this effects LFO, which lets you apply various kind of modulations to LFO1. For example, it's taking LFO1 and I can apply a sample and hold to that to create kind of custom LFO shapes, which is kind of a unique feature. And then it's also got a bunch of really unique filter modes built in. So for example, I really like this filter one is like a sort of distorted filter.
Are there any presets made for this yet? Have you got anything you can play us that will demonstrate its full sonic capability?
Well, I can show you kind of a baseline that I've got programmed here with Meld that's got some interesting stuff going on. So what you might hear on this one, we've got this kind of growly filter, is we're in the sub modes. There's like a dedicated sub oscillator for generating kind of subby tones. And then the LFO effects is applying this kind of really interesting modulation to it. This kind of oscillator there. There's built-in drive, which you can really kind of make it get pretty gnarly and distorted. But it's really something that sort of requires quite a bit of time to go in and explore, because it's quite a hard synth to demonstrate because there's such a wide range of sounds that it can create.
And that's polyphonic, is it? Or is it
Yes, oh yeah,
yeah,
definitely
okay,
polyphonic. The other thing that's quite interesting about this synth is it also has scale awareness. So we mentioned scale awareness earlier with the MIDI devices, but scale awareness can also apply to instruments. And where this applies in the synth itself is in certain oscillators. You'll notice that they have these little icons, and that means that that oscillator is going to do something with that scale information. So for example, just to demonstrate this, if I use these regular basic shapes without scale awareness on, it's detuning in cents.
Yeah.
Whereas if I turn the scale awareness on,
it's detuning to relevant intervals.
Exactly, right, based on the scale that you have selected. And so the scale awareness applies in multiple locations. You've got some scale aware filters. So
nice.
Sort of a really interesting sort of start to where scale awareness can creep into some other devices in live as well. While we've got this loaded up, I'm going to switch back to the sub oscillator and look at the new effect, which is called Raw. So again, very deep device. We could spend a lot of time on this, but at the sort of most basic level, Raw is a distortion device. You can hear it applying some distortion to that bass sound. And what's quite unique is that it's got multiple different distortion modes. So that's like a typical soft sine. You've got tube preamp, all the way to kind of more weird and wonderful things like noise injection. Right. Kind of adding that noisy distortion to my personal favorite is shards. Kind of really this interesting sort of stereo crackling effect. So you've got those interesting distortion modes. You have built-in modulation with a wavetable style modulation matrix that you can apply to these as well. So if I apply that, you can see that that distortion amount is being modulated by the LFO. We've got LFO, envelope, noise. There's built-in feedback as well, so you can feed the device back into itself.
Oh, that's unusual. I mean, certainly in software, it's not all that common to be able to create actual internal feedback loops, is it?
Exactly.
You can break stuff.
Yeah. Well, breaking stuff is kind of the point here. You can get some really pretty gnarly sounds out of the feedback. You can even tune that to a particular note.
Right.
Which is pretty fun. Built-in compressor. But where this sort of really starts to get out of hand is at the moment we've been working in the single routing, but there's multiple different routings here, for example, serial distortions, parallel distortions, all the way to full multi-band distortion, high, mid, and low.
So there's quite a lot of
and then you can pop that out into a nice big full screen display.
That's great, isn't it? That I mean, I'm guessing this is something we're going to see a bit more of as devices get more complex with more UI elements. I mean, this makes total sense.
Exactly. It seems to be sort of a direction that Ableton's heading. Even this mod matrix, you're starting to see that appear in multiple locations as well. But it's just a really fun device to use because it's just super deep and great to play with in full screen here. So we already saw some of the new or updated MIDI effects, rather. There is also one new MIDI effect, which is called CC control. So this is something that previously you had to rely on Macs for Live devices to do, but essentially this lets you control external MIDI gear directly from Live, and it's just a native device. So you can send things like mod wheel information or custom CC information to external MIDI gear.
Right, so that just goes out to a MIDI output.
Exactly. Right. So it's really nice sort of having that as a native device. There's also been some updates to the Macs for Live modulators. So they have their own category now in the browser. So that's things like LFO, Shaper, etc. If I drag one of those in, the devices themselves have had some updates. So you'll see, like for example, LFO has this new steps feature where I can sort of step the waveform. There's some different waveforms built in here. But really the main new thing is the way that the mapping of them works. So previously the way these devices would work is I click map and I click control, and it's mapped to that. And so this is the previous behavior, what's now called remote, where that control is completely taken over. So being modulated there, that particular filter. But now I have this other mode called mod, where I don't lose control of that. I can still adjust this control, but the modulation is applied in real time.
So the center frequency is defined by the parameter.
Exactly,
itself.
And the modulation is happening around that. So it just gives you a lot more sort of flexibility.
And obviously if you're going to the extremes, it just figures out that, you know, it can only go one direction, presumably.
Yeah, it's not going to go past the range of the control itself. So there are going to be a couple new packs available as well. Currently, those aren't available as we're still in the beta stage, but as we move further along in the beta stage, there will be some additional sound packs available as well. But that just about covers all the new features.
So presumably, this will be released for public beta on the day you see this video, if everything goes according to plan. Just to be clear, though, so 12, when it does come out, will also be running on push standalone as well. So it'll be parity across those two things, right?
Exactly, that's correct. In terms of sort of what is new on the push, the new devices will obviously be accessible and controllable directly from the push, but there's not too many other new features. So things like the MIDI tools, for example, for now is all just within Live itself.
So I believe, so Ableton are running like a 20% discount sale up to the end of the year, right?
That's correct. So anyone who was around for the previous update will be familiar with this. Is in that period between when the public beta is announced and it's officially released, you'll be able to buy the current version, Live 11, for a 20% discount, and then when 12 comes out, you get a free upgrade.
But this ultimately will be a paid upgrade. If I'm running 11 Suite now, and I've had it for years, then there will be some sort of upgrade fee. But I suppose you have to log into your account to find out exactly what it is, because there's so many different places you could upgrade
Exactly,
from.
It's going to depend on what version of Live you have, what edition of Live you have. So the best thing to do is just log into your Ableton account, and you'll be able to see what the upgrade price will be there.
Okay, Tom, thanks very much for coming down. That was the first look at the sort of new version of Ableton 12 as it hits public beta. That's it for this time. See you next time.